Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I will start with a confession. This live stream isn't actually live. This was recorded a couple of days ago. Stuart couldn't make it at the live time. Hopefully, I am going to be live in the comments. So if you're on wherever you're watching, hopefully I'll be there as well. Pop up and we'll join in the interaction when this is broadcast live. But our special guest probably needs no introduction to most of you. Stuart Waiton, who's been on the live stream a couple of times before, I think. And there's a familiar face and a familiar name to people who follow current affairs in Scotland. Stuart is a sociology lecturer at Abertay University, but he's a writer, speaker, campaigner, and generally interesting person to have a chat with about the issues of the day. So welcome, Stuart.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. So you're up in Dundee now, are you?
I am indeed, yes.
Right.
It's quite mild now. It's been yesterday was cold and miserable, and today it's overcast. But it's actually it's almost muggy and a little bit. It almost feels like summer at the minute. So I'm happy.
Well, we've got sunshine here, as you can see. If I go over there, you can see I get the sunshine problem with my blind. So we've got lots of things to discuss as ever. Now, I had a look through your Facebook feed. You've got interesting comments and all sorts of things. And I saw a post you made about poverty and the effect or the wisdom of labeling people as being in poverty in a country like Scotland. What were you thinking there?
Well, I think it was triggered by strangely watching The Last Dance, which is the Michael Jordan story on Netflix, which if anyone hasn't seen it, it's one of the best things I've ever seen. And I'm not a basketball fan. I knew almost nothing about Michael Jordan. But not to bore your audience too much. But if I was to describe him, I would say he's an Aristotelian man of virtue. He's an extraordinary man.
I think that's what most of his fans say, actually.
He's an extraordinary man, very balanced and very interesting in everything he does. Incredibly impressive human being. But anyway, it wasn't about him. It was about one of his other players, Pippen, Scottie Pippen. And Scottie Pippen made the observation, which I've heard a few times, that when he was young, he grew up, there was a big family. I think it was his family where his dad had a heart attack and was in a wheelchair. There was another family in a wheelchair, blah, blah, blah. And Scottie Pippen says, we lived in poverty. He says, although we never knew it at the time, right? By which I thought, well, that's interesting, because I think what he meant was they didn't have much money, right? But that wasn't of any thing particularly. They got on with their life. They might, they have to scrimp and scrape for money and so on, but they didn't think about themselves as living in poverty, right? Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because nowadays we talk a lot about poverty, and obviously a lot of it is like relative poverty, which, as far as I can remember, something like earning only 40% of the average wage or something like that, or 60%, which for a lot of people, it doesn't seem like what you would think of as poverty, but it's the term poverty is used quite broadly. And I just got thinking about this label and whether it is unhelpful to label people as living in poverty, because it's almost like potentially you're being patronized and patted on the head. You live in poverty, right? Poor you live in poverty. Whereas historically, I'd often thought about the idea of poverty as having a kind of political dimension, which I think it might have done, where you use the term poverty as a campaign to show the inequalities in society, that inequality needs to be challenged, so on and so forth, and all the rest of it. But I just thought it's an interesting one in terms of actually, is there actually something problematic about society and professionals dumping this label of poverty onto people, which to a certain extent takes the fact that you haven't got that much money and makes a this into almost a victim status. Whereas actually, just because you don't have that much money, it doesn't mean you're a victim of anything in particular. You might be quite a strong character. You might be a part of your community. You might be quite active. Your children might be quite involved in things. It might be in a church member. You might play football. You might do all sorts of things. But this label of poverty becomes almost like a victim category today. That's potentially dumped onto people. And I just thought, well, perhaps it's actually debilitating rather than liberating today to have this label, as I say, almost thrust onto people. So you are in poverty, which I wouldn't be hard and fast about this, because I appreciate that, recognizing that people are, and society has an unequal dynamic to it, and there are lots of problems which need to be resolved, and housing issues and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't want to downplay that. But anyway, that's what. So I just thought I'd throw that out and see.
That's interesting. That has triggered, in the old-fashioned sense, lots of thoughts. I mean, but the way you describe it, it's almost like, maybe we're going to talk later on about the new sort of anti-racist philosophy, with the white privilege, where if you're of a certain race, then that's like an automatic disadvantage to everything you do in your life.
Mm.
And poverty takes on that sort of role as well, doesn't it? It's like the universal cause, or a universal cause, of bad things that happen to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting because, I think back to the sort of 1980s when I was always left wing, and miners' strike, and concerned about inequality, and a group in Newcastle Industries were closing, and so I was spontaneously on the left. But working class issues at that time, as understood, were really usually about employment and unemployment. Less so poverty. It was more employment and unemployment. And it's almost like, I wonder if the sort of poverty campaign framework is more of a kind of middle class professional charitable sentiment, which has good aspects to it. But I do think today it is increasingly the case that even the working class, not just in terms of poverty, but the working class, when you use the term working class, especially in sort of policy documents, where really what they mean is a victim group, or a vulnerable group. That's kind of what they mean, which is, it's ironic, because especially as we see now, when trade unions actually decide to take action, that concern about the working class dissipates very, very quickly, and it's. But they're only happy talking about the working class when they can pat them on the head,
that's interesting, the difference between like fighting unemployment and fighting poverty. Because unemployment is a much broader, more multifaceted problem than poverty, real or relative or whatever poverty, isn't it? Because that's got a lot of other elements in terms of self-esteem and fulfillment, purpose in life, whatever. So it's a much more clear-cut, positive goal, I think. People seeking employment, people wanting jobs, rather than trying to tackle poverty. I mean, in Scotland, we don't really hear much at all about tackling unemployment. That's just not on the political agenda, isn't it? But tackling poverty, for tackling poverty, you just have to give people money, don't you? Tackling unemployment, we have to stimulate the economy. You have to encourage business. Rather, I'm not quite sure how to do that, apart from like paying people to do things they don't really need. And they're doing that's an interesting point. A few more things that you maybe think. I've heard Africans say that they feel that Westerners have got the impression that Africa is a sort of hellhole and everyone's miserable because things are so awful. And they say it's not like that at all. People are really, really happy, in general. They're really enjoying their lives. It's great. I mean, there are serious issues that need addressing, but overall, people are very satisfied and often very happy.
Yeah, well, it's
quite difficult to imagine without some of the services.
Yeah, it's funny because a lot of kind of left-wing thought is often condemnatory of what they call consumer culture, and then the same people, if someone's ability to consume is a bit too low, they categorize, these people are in poverty. Whereas actually their lives might not be that poor, which isn't to say these certain aspect unemployment and all the rest which shouldn't be addressed, but it's a kind of narrowing down of what the human experience, to be what it means to be human and to have a fulfilling life. You can live on a moderate income and have an entirely fulfilling family life and community life and life in the world and so on and so forth. Probably more than we ever have, actually, because of the internet and your capacity to actually access all sorts of things. Anyway, so it's just a thought.
Yeah, I mean, it's well known as that. I mean, once people get above a certain income, that the additional income doesn't contribute anything to their happiness or well-being. Or whatever, it just makes no difference.
Yeah. And I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm a big believer in growth. I mean, I think growth is absolutely central to improvements in society. And I think historically, you can look at what like the Industrial Revolution was arguably the most important thing that's ever happened in human history in terms of its transformative capacity. And I'm a very strong believer in growth as being really important. And environmentalism often depresses me because it seems to have an anti-growth dynamic to it. So I'm not arguing for we can be happy in our limited lives. I mean, I think I want more for everybody around the world, but nevertheless, it was just this thought of this idea of the category of poverty that seems to be sort of used and how to think about it.
Yeah. You said about relative poverty earlier on. I remember hearing a few years ago that relative poverty, I think it is something like 60% of the median income. So, I mean, whether you're in poverty, it depends on your household is the unit that's relevant. So an individual's income isn't particularly relevant. The other thing is, I mean, a few years ago, the median income went down. So nationally, earnings went down. So the result was there were less people in poverty.
Yeah.
Because the poverty line went down as well. So if you want to lift people out of poverty, just depress wages overall, and it's done.
Yeah.
But I think with left-wing politics, often the assumption is, health, education, anything, the root cause, the universal root cause, is poverty. I mean, it's money that makes a difference. And often, if you look at the correlation between these two things, there often is a fairly strong correlation between wealth and most other outcomes for a person. But the assumption, unjustified assumption, I think, is often that it's the money that's the root cause, and that's causing all of the others. But I mean, to be controversial for a moment, I think a significant part of these correlations is to do with personality traits and IQ as well. I mean, if you're a very conscientious person and self-disciplined, are you likely to make more money? Well, yes. Are you likely to look after yourself health-wise as well? Well, yes. And there's lots of other things like that, but it just seems to be taboo to even mention those.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, I don't agree with you. I've had this argument since when I was at Jordan Hill doing my community education qualification. I had a similar discussion, and I'm not convinced that the class framework of society is based on IQ and character types. Although, obviously, within a framework of people, I do think there are things in terms of intelligence, character type that will give you advantages and disadvantages. But I think if you are born in more difficult circumstances than other people, then I think it is more difficult to get out. And actually, I worry in particular about the role of education in this, because I think increasingly jobs that at least give you a certain amount of better pay, but also more influence in society in terms of the sort of professional jobs, you need a qualification more and more to get that now. So for a nurse, you need a degree. Police will soon be possibly a degree. To get into almost any job now, you need a degree. And I would suggest that working class boys in particular are less inclined to want to go to university for lots of reasons. even though they have got the intelligence to do most of these jobs. But they will almost necessarily be squeezed out of professions because you have to go through a 4-year degree and then do a professional course, and it's 5 or 6 years. So I do have a concern about that. The expansion of university at one level can be seen as positive, but I also think it's got a negative dynamic to it, that a lot of people who are at university are really just there to get a qualification for a job. And I'm not convinced that a lot of those people actually need to be going to university rather than being trained. But a different issue. But anyway,
just going back to my point, you said you disagreed. I wasn't saying it was the full picture. I was saying there were lots of other factors as well. But I'm saying it's part of the picture.
Yeah. I think that's.
I was reading something. Have you read Head, Heart, Hand? I think it is is it David Goodenough?
Goodhart.
Have you seen that? Goodhart. He's the one.
Yeah, I haven't read it. I know of it, and yes, I think it's an interesting. Yeah, so he is arguing that we've foolishly put too much energy into head and thinking that type of education is everything, and rather than hand as in technical skills and so on, and heart as in caring. So these jobs are not appreciated as much and seen as being professional, or are not well paid enough. And I think it's a very interesting argument, especially about care workers, because care workers are paid rubbish. And yet the reality is, which we will all know from our experience, especially with older people and so on, is that a good care worker is worth their weight in gold, and they're not all as good as others, but they are not appreciated financially. Which is
the market should sort that out eventually.
Not necessarily, because anyone could be arguably a care worker, right? So the skills levels are just life skills, which is why it's relatively poorly paid.
It's supply and demand, though, isn't it? Whatever. If you're an employer, you need people to do a job. Basically, you need to increase the salary to the level where you get enough people to do the job that you want them to do. It doesn't matter what skill level or qualifications.
Yeah, but the skill level is low, isn't it? The skill level is low, and how can you assess someone's caringness? That seems to be the difficulty, right? Because someone who cares brilliantly for a relative who is very old and all the rest of it will be getting paid close to the minimum wage, right? And the argument is, well, because anyone can do that, and it's true, anyone can do that, but not everyone can do it well. And at the minute, I don't see any framework that is able and allows care workers to actually get something approaching a decent wage.
Yeah, I can see that issue. I think the market should deal with the issue of we can't get enough people to be care workers. In that case, the wages need to go up until you get people. In terms of assessing people's effectiveness in the role, I think there are some careers where it's not really in the interest of the employer to have a good job being done. Just an adequate job will be fine. So I can see that could be a problem in that case.
Yeah. But the other side of it was also Goodhart was arguing that we fetishized education, as in university education, to the detriment of, say, plumbing and bricklaying, these other jobs. And so you end up, it's a kind of ongoing joke that, to the extent to which it's true, I don't know, but it does seem to have a reality to it, especially if you go to places like London, is that, if you want a good plumber or a good this, it's like the idea that they'll be Polish. You have to ask yourself, why is that? Because a plumber is an extremely useful, good, skilled job where you can set up your own business and so on and so forth. But there seems to be, you need to have someone from Poland to be your plumber. Less so in Scotland, I suspect, but you know what I mean. So if that is the case, then you have to ask yourself, what is it we're doing wrong in terms of prioritizing education and training and so on.
The other thing he was saying in his book, he talks about America in particular. In America, apparently, it's illegal to use IQ tests in job selection processes. It's illegal because they don't come out the same for every racial group. So they banned them. So companies really want to know that, because that's really the correlation between IQ and your ability to do a job well is pretty strong. So players would love to do that, but they can't. So he was arguing that what they do instead, they use the admissions processes of universities as a proxy for IQ tests. So if someone's been to Harvard, they couldn't care less that they've studied ancient history for 3 or 4 years or whatever. What they're interested in is they got in. And that means that they got over that very high bar. And that's the more important thing than not just what they studied, but that they even did the course isn't really that important to them. It's just using it as, so it's like $100,000 alternative to doing an IQ test for the employers. So, interesting. Right, let's just move on. That was interesting. That was a new issue. Made me think about a few things. Now, I saw you've been commenting a couple of times about issues within sports, politicization within sports. I mean, where do we start with that? Is it maybe football? Do you happen to encounter this?
Yeah, it's funny that at a time when politics, I mean, I would almost describe politics as being dead almost, or certainly in the last 25 years, the Brexit Trump stuff has at least thrown a few spanners in the works. But at a time when there's what I would describe as almost no politics, everything else seems to be political. So education is now being politicized, and so is sport, in every way. So I mean, as you know. Whatever the latest campaign is, or awareness week or awareness month, football will be at the forefront of it. And I've always taken quite a hard line on this, that I feel I detest it. I detest anti-racism in football, for example, not because I'm racist. In fact, the opposite is true. But because I just feel it's so patronizing, especially with football, that, and it's an interesting thing because it's all about raising awareness, right? Which is the interest. I think I might have said this to you before. I can't remember. But anyway, the interesting thing about raising awareness is it's not like knowledge or education, because you're never told it just once, right? You have to be told it 1,000 times, right? So it's not that they just have 1 week where they say we're trying to raise awareness of racism in Britain and blah 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 or anything else, which they don't even raise awareness of anything. They just say don't be racist, right? And that it's like a mantra, it's like a chant. I mean, these words seem out of place, but to me it is like Maoism, where you've got a kind of cultural revolution and you have these people who run society and they're just shouting. I mean, I watch Sky a lot and you get flashing symbols across the screen saying be against racism, right? It's like, can we have a picture of Chairman Mao popping up as well, or perhaps Nicola Sturgeon or somebody else, just to make sure I'm on the right track. And you don't do that. You know what I mean? It's like every lefty person knows subliminal advertising is like outrageous, and these kind of image flashing. It's like part of left-wing cultural understanding that you don't do this, this is what authoritarians do, right? And yet it's Sky, it's the BBC, it's all these groups, the advertisements around, the flashing, this, whatever the awareness thing is. And you have to step back and say, look, we're against racism, but look at what this is, I mean, this is a very peculiar type of thing that's happening now, where you constantly have to be sort of basically shouting, wagging, oh, that's this, and constantly again and again and again and again and again. And I find it really, really disturbingly unpleasant and contemptuous. This is the thing that really annoys me. It's this idea that these football fans, because you have to come to the conclusion, is the people doing this think that football fans need this.
Mm-hmm.
They need.
Do they? Do they really think they're doing any good, or are the organising bodies just doing it for their own benefit?
Well, I think it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? I think the modern elites, for want of a better term, are in search of a sense of moral goodness, right, or virtue, and that's why the term virtual signaling is actually quite a useful term or even category to explain what's actually happening. Because I do think the people who run society have abandoned almost everything from the past, all traditions, whether it's liberal, conservative, socialist. Those traditions are gone, and you've got these new elites who are forming a new type of ideology and moral purpose as they perceive it. And so on. I think it's both. I think they genuinely think that ordinary people are bigots who need to be told. And what bigotry means is expanding all the time. So it can be almost anything. So microaggressions and so on. I mean, it's an ever expanding category of what bigotry is. But ultimately, I think that it stems from their lack of tradition, their lack of substance, where they need a sense of purpose and mission, which is why I think you end up, the Black Lives Matter thing happens, and suddenly you've got Sky, you've got Microsoft, you've got Google, everybody, almost every major right-on institution, which is just about every institution as far as I can see, suddenly grab the BLM logo and stick it on themselves, from nowhere. And then suddenly people go, do you know what Black Lives Matter actually represent? And then they sort of they shuffle their bum a bit. And, well, we're not doing it for that. We're not taking the knee because of that. We're taking it for this. And then, we're not. We're just against discrimination and so on. And there's something really unstable, really unstable and unhinged about the way these things suddenly, they just jump on them. And then they're sort of shocked when some football fans don't think, taking the knee and getting on your knees is.
So there's no resistance, isn't there? The media turns as one behind one of these causes, and then let's say institutions, businesses again as one. They adopt it. I mean, the take of the knee thing. I mean, anyone who's been honest about it, they realize that's not just anti-racism. That's connecting to a particular interpretation of the situation in America and how to tackle what sort of philosophy to use to tackle racism. It's obviously not just merely an anti-racist gesture. I mean, I find the commentators frustrated because I'm sure some of the commentators in sport, they don't go along with it as well, but they daren't just say anything. I mean, I'm a motor racing fan. I mean, we've had a fair share of it. So, mind you, they're taking the knee. Sort of half the drivers wouldn't do it in Formula One.
Yeah, that was interesting.
Which was good. But you get people like, Sebastian Vettel, who's a bit past it as a driver, but he parrots all the right lines about all the right issues. And so he ends up on Question Time a couple of weeks ago. It's obviously, you're saying the right things, so you're on. We'll give you the platform. But then in the sort of magazines and the news reporting, not just the BBC, everywhere, it's Lewis Hamilton, great driver, and he's also making a real difference with his activism. That's right. Whereas I look at his activism and think it's misguided. Special schemes so more black people can be racing drivers. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. Like 99.99% of the world's population have no opportunity at all to be a racing driver. So if he wants to cut it down to get more black racing drivers, I just think it's ridiculous. Even if that was a genuine cause, out of all the charitable causes in the world, is that really the most acute, where you want to be focusing your wealth? I don't really, don't really think it is.
Well, again, it's a fascinating thing that again people on the left for decades have condemned what they call celebrity culture. Right. And they see celebrity culture and they say celebrity culture, it's like celebrities becoming more and more important. and it's ridiculous, and working class people are buy into this, and they need to be a bit smarter, blah blah blah, and they condemn the vacuity of celebrity culture. And yet, they adopt, they're more than happy to have celebrities fronting United Nations, children's charities, Hamilton, etc. I mean, it's a complete hypocrisy that they condemn celebrity culture, and then once celebrities are parroting the latest kind of woke sentences, that they love celebrity. It's again.
Some racing drivers have been signed up by the World Economic Forum, and they're like official representatives on them. If you're interested, Nico Rosberg is one. Michael Schumacher was one. He's not in a state to be doing that anymore. I mean, Lewis Hamilton and Sebastian Vettel, obviously, they've given their CV in already by their public profile. Yeah. But again, I think that's sort of, people need to know that that's happening. So every time one of those drivers is commentating on a race or being interviewed or whatever, and they start talking about some political issue, there needs to be a thing coming up at the bottom of the screen saying, this sportsman is actually a representative or is employed by or whatever by the World Economic Forum. Just a matter of simple transparency.
Yeah, well, again, it's funny because I think this again reflects the sort of vacuity of the modern elites. That it's like this talk of role models. It's like if the people running institutions in society and business and politics and all the rest of it had any substance or character or sense of direction, they would be the role models, the professionals and so on. They construct this idea that sports people are role models because it's more to do with their sense that ordinary people aren't connected to them. So they then elevate this idea that ordinary football fans look to whoever it is, the latest footballer here, Roy Keane or anyone else from the past, they're a role model. Well, actually, what that is suggesting is the elite's own sense of insecurity. Yeah. That they realize that they are not able to carry the public, and then they sort of reimagine that football players, all working class kids are all looking up at Harry Kane, and like if Harry Kane, abuses his wife, then the kids will all be abusing their wives because of, this kind of really patronizing sheep-like expectation of how ordinary people actually relate to football fans, as if that's how it works. I mean, the David Goodwillie thing being the obvious example. It's like the rapist David Goodwillie will mean that football fans turn up and think, oh, it's all right to rape somebody because he's allowed to play football. I mean, it's you couldn't get much more contemptuous than that.
I mean, politicians don't apply that to themselves, do they?
No.
Just go about like the sportsman. If you went back a few decades, a sportsman, if he wanted to be known as a bit of a doer of good works in the world with his vast fortune, then what you'd do is you'd set up projects for orphans or homeless people or hunger relief, whatever. And the tension would be, people would say, oh, but you've still got, your millions or your billions. Okay, you're giving away a bit. That's great. But you're still hugely wealthy. So, we're not quite convinced that would be the sort of dynamic. Whereas now, actually parting with your money, there's no pressure to do that at all. That's off the agenda. It's just a matter of saying the right things and waving the right flags.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Yeah.
You just world hunger. Where's it gone?
Yeah, although you do
you
get,
never hear a word about it.
You get the odd. It's like I think Mane, Sadio Mane, the Liverpool player. I think he does stuff like that, and you get some of these African players. And there was it one of the Toures? I can't remember. Yaya Toure, one of them. So you get some of these African players do exactly that. But they're not exactly heralded. But as you say, if someone sort of like Lewis Hamilton's, suddenly becomes an anti-racist activist based on nothing, as far as I can see, other than the fact that he's got darker skin, then he's a superhero for that. But yes.
I suppose the classic case, I'm not aware of this of having happened yet, but it could happen, is you'll get some sportsman, let's say now an African footballer, who's given like tens of millions of pounds to famine relief and worthy causes, perhaps in his home nation in Africa. But then he declines to wear a rainbow boots or something in Pride Month and gets fired.
Mm.
I mean, I'm not aware of a story like that, but there probably has already been.
Well, you know the Odessa Gay one, the French player?
Yes, yeah, I saw that, yeah. Well, how did that end? He refused to wear rainbow numbers on his...
I haven't heard, yeah. So Paris Saint-Germain player, Muslim, they wanted him to wear a strip that had rainbow colours on the number on his back. He refused, and then he's denounced in France as, you know, you must apologise. You're a disgrace, etc., etc., etc. As far as I know, I don't know where that's gone. I think it's just he'll be back playing, I assume. But there was public outrage, at least by right-thinking people, about the fact that this guy wouldn't wear. And it was, I mean, it was interesting because I was on the television with Peter Tatchell, and Peter Tatchell was, I mean, essentially he ends up being an authoritarian because his argument is that you should force people to adopt beliefs, even though it goes completely counter to their own beliefs, and he's not concerned about that whatsoever. He's quite happy. No, they should be forced to do it because it's you're breaching human rights somehow, whatever that means in this context of not recognizing and supporting and affirming different groups. Which is that just to say, if people want to understand an aspect of what's happening today in terms of politics, is that we've shifted from politics that were connected to kind of welfare and wealth to the politics of recognition, as it's called, right? Which is a kind of therapeutic framework for where you have to recognize people for who they are. You have to recognize their identity. You need to affirm their identity and so on. And that's increasingly becoming the framework of kind of politics, policy, and in fact law. This idea that, you know, everyone's identity must be recognized by everybody, and if you don't recognize them, you're somehow damaging them and actually undermining their human rights. That's kind of the shift of where we're going at the minute.
Yeah, I remember talking to Patrick Harvey. This is years ago. This is maybe it's maybe 8 or 9 years ago. I was involved in a debate with him, and we did this little, I did a radio podcast interview or something afterwards. And I said to him, you know, do you think I should be fired as a teacher? Should I be allowed to teach? He said, no, you should definitely be fired with your views. So I said to him after, I said, we used to hear lots about tolerance from people like you. I didn't seem to hear much about tolerance now. And he said, oh, yes. I said, well, I'm not interested in tolerance. I'm interested in equality. It's equality we talk about now. So we're quite open about it. Because you remember that tolerance was all the thing, wasn't it? When... if things like, say, the LGBT issue, when the issue was that there was, you know, maybe even a majority of people disapproving or whatever, then tolerance is the message. But once you get over the critical mass, tolerance goes out the window, and it's
but that's
enforcement.
It's not. I would say it's put a slightly different spin on that, which is that when they say tolerance today, they don't mean classical tolerance. So historically, classical tolerance meant that you would judge what someone said, and you might hate what they say, but you wouldn't stop them from saying it. That was tolerance. Whereas modern tolerance, what modern tolerance means is it's more about recognizing groups. Right? If you are a tolerant person today, you are a multicultural person who respects all cultures, right? That's what they mean by tolerance. So it's actually that the term, in fact, you could, to bore people slightly, but you can look at almost every liberal category and look at how it's used today, and it's been bastardized, right? So the idea of freedom, for example, becomes something like freedom from fear, right, which was the Tony Blair's thing, and freedom from fear basically means more policing, right, rather than freedom. Tolerance. Now we talk about the need for zero tolerance, and it's the most tolerant people who demand zero tolerance, right?
Mm-hmm.
So all these liberal categories have been have metamorphosized into something that is almost the opposite of what it's historically meant. So I think they'll still continue to use the term tolerance, but they don't mean what you mean. They in fact mean the opposite, which is respect for different groups. And if you speak out of turn, you are not respecting those groups and you must be silenced, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is where the complete contradiction comes in, because that now is what it means to be a tolerant person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right, let's move on to another topic. I saw you had a thing or two to say about the conversion therapy issue. Have you been following the progress of the discussion in the Scottish Parliament?
I haven't particularly. I should be, because I'm going to be chatting with some people about this in a couple of weeks. But I can tell you my brief thoughts on this, and then maybe you can fill me in a bit more detail. But my concerns about this is that essentially what it appears to me to be is that you are moving to a situation where, if you're a Christian or a Muslim or perhaps someone who, for whatever reason, is not keen on homosexuality, or however you want to frame it, and you try to persuade another adult who is happy for you to be there and having this conversation, but if you try and persuade another adult that perhaps they should rethink their sexuality, then that is potentially criminal. Mm-hmm. Which, if that is how the law ends up being, it's extraordinary. And it's extraordinary that there's almost no opposition to this, because it basically means that you are saying you cannot express your beliefs, and you expressing your beliefs to another grown-up is criminal. Which is, I can't think of a more authoritarian law than that. If this is, because they talk about in terms of manipulation, as far as I can tell, that you are being, if you manipulate, which I don't know what that means in the context of grown-ups having a conversation. It's like you could say every conversation is a form of manipulation. So yes, I'm deeply concerned about it. But has there been any interesting developments in the Scottish Parliament about this?
Well, with the UK Parliament, first of all, you're probably aware of this. The Conservative government went through their process, considered it very carefully, listened to the evidence, and they came to the conclusion, we don't need a law. This is unnecessary. Big outcry, Twitter storm. So they said, oh, okay, then we'll have one after all. What a way to... So in other words, people could end up in prison because there was a Twitter storm. The government thought the law was unnecessary. But
I thought
to keep people happy.
I thought what it was is that they decided against having that law in relation to transgender issues, but not in relation
that's the current case.
To homosexuality.
They originally said it was completely unnecessary, lock, stock, and barrel. Then there was an outcry, so they said, "Okay, we'll bring it back, but we won't have the trans bit in it." But which there's still an outcry about. In Scotland, it's at early stages. But there's every indication it's going to be as bad as any conversion therapy law anywhere in the world. So they explicitly say you cannot consent. So even if, let's say, the young Muslim goes to the mosque, reads his Quran, listens to the imam, and thinks, I'm same-sex attracted. I don't want to go down that road. I'm going to speak to my imam. I'm going to see if you can help me. We'll talk about it, and we'll see if we can steer my life in a different direction. Then that would be illegal. So that Muslim who wants to move away from his same-sex attraction, doesn't want to go down that road, he can only seek counselling. He's not allowed to seek counselling from someone who agrees with him. Someone who thinks, yes, I think you're doing the right thing. If they think that, then that should be that should be criminal. They call it torture, which is so ridiculous. It just needs laughing at. It doesn't need arguing with. It needs laughing at.
Yeah.
And in the Parliament, they were saying, you can't consent to torture, can you? Therefore, consent's no defence against conversion therapy. I mean, the standard of debate is pitiful, but that's
But
the
you
way
see,
it's going. And no one's opposing it. No one is opposing it at all.
this is what I love about the Scottish Parliament, is that the Scottish Parliament is purified new elites. You know, it's like Scotland is always ahead of the game, right?
Yeah.
And the reason that from the kind of new elites handbook, the reason that the Scottish Parliament is right to argue what they're arguing is because this is a framework that no longer treats people as adult subjects, right? It treats people as vulnerable or part of vulnerable groups who don't really have individual capacity and need to be protected. And also, it's a focus on the idea of your identity as being something which is that's what you are, right? It's everything is your identity. It's not in relation to you as a human being who is part of the world and so on. It's this fetishization of identity as being the essence of your humanity. And so if someone is like thinks that they're gay, then that's their identity. It's like this. They do this in schools. So when trans kids at the age of whatever, however young they are, say, "Oh, I'm trans," then that's their identity, right? That's their essence. And the Scottish Parliament and the schools and the education system says that's their essence. So we're going to back them. That is what they are, and they fetishize identity, and then see any attempt to that might be slightly quizzical or questioning or whatever about that identity as a form of abuse, right? Because people are vulnerable and their identity is key to who they are, and if you're questioning them, and hey presto, entirely makes sense. Conversion therapy, that's a form of torture, because you can't really expect grown-ups to have a capacity to actually have a conversation. I mean, it's unbelievably Orwellian and authoritarian in terms of its potential outcome, that you refuse to allow individuals to have conversations with who they want to have conversations with.
I mean, are we saying to me that I am not allowed to talk to anyone because of my beliefs? I can't even enter into the conversation with another person, even if they come and say, "Please, please, please help me. Please, can I talk to you about this issue?" I'm not allowed to. I'd have to say, "No, you can't talk to me. You need to go and find someone who doesn't agree with you."
Yeah.
And that's the person you can talk to. I think the identity thing is very important. I think there's another element as well. If you think about, say, let's say a transgender person, I mean, surely something within them is thinking, "I know I'm not really a woman. I know that. I'm trying to pretend I am. But some people don't believe me, and I get really annoyed they don't believe me." And those people, they can't stand the thought that there's anyone who's basically thinking they've made the wrong choice. If someone says, "I've got these feelings that I want to be a woman, but I don't want to do that. That's not the road I want to go down. That's not the life for me. I want to put those thoughts aside, and I want to live my life as a man." Then for people who've made the transgender choice, I mean, they hate that. They hate that because that's implying that they maybe made the wrong choice. And the same goes with homosexual relationships as well. There's some people who can't bear the thought that there are other people who exist who preferred a different option than the one that they took. And because they're so emboldened in every other area, they just get whatever they demand from the government. They're now saying, "We don't want to hear about people who make these other choices." I mean, I've spoken to people, lots of people, if they declare that they're not gay anymore, then they just get appalling treatment. I had someone on the live stream the other week. He was an X Factor contestant in Malta. And partway through the show, he said that he used to be gay, but he wasn't anymore. So they kicked him off. Yeah, he was off. Yeah. Because that's the perspective that's just completely excluded from mainstream media.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I mean, I campaign for gay rights. I mean, I don't agree with Christians on homosexuality and so on and so forth. But I entirely accept people should be allowed to have conversations and discussions, arguments about anything they like, whatever those things are. But
Mhm.
I do think it's an interesting thing now that we seem to have moved to an idea that being gay is kind of in your genes. And now so when I was growing up, that was seen as a bit backward and reactionary, the idea that it's in your genes. And people said, well, no, it's more of a sort of like socialization and it's a choice thing and la la la, whatever it is. Whereas now there's this idea that which seems to have become adopted in society, is that it's a kind of, if you're gay, you're just gay. And, you know, and I know people who've had gay relationships and then moved on and not had gay relationships, you know, and you know, it's unusual, but it does happen. But either way, whatever the situation, and I think that's slightly different from my perspective anyway, from the trans issue, which I think is far more problematic as far as I'm concerned, in terms of there is no reality to, you might think you're a woman, but you're not, right? I mean, that's just unfortunate, you know, and once you're an adult, you can do what you like. But there is something much more problematic for me about the whole trans framework. But either way, it shouldn't matter in terms of whether people want to have a conversation with somebody. That's their free, you know, it's basic freedom of association, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, you know, these most basic fundamental freedoms that, as far as I can see, they're just being thrown in the bin around this issue.
Yeah. I would say, even if someone doesn't want to have the conversation, then you know, you're free to start a conversation with anyone you like and offer them unsolicited advice. You know, the law's already in place to deal with someone if it becomes harassing or whatever. You know, there's laws to deal with that.
Yeah.
So yeah, people should be free to do that. Listen to the campaign in Scotland's been led by one young man in particular, Blair someone, I can't remember his second name, but the foundation of his case is his experience at the hands of his parents. I mean, he basically completely slates his parents and says that they'd, you know, really appallingly abused him. It doesn't actually give specifics of what happened. But when I hear that, I mean, I've got two problems. One is I think it's really disloyal to speak about your parents like that, no matter what. But the other thing is, it's all taken at face value. So the MSPs all just sit there nodding away. I'm thinking, well, hang on, there's another side to this story. That they're don't even begin to express any interest in trying to make sure there's a balanced view. And it just reminds me of the Thai campaign. Remember the Thai campaign? One of their leaders told a story about what this teacher said to him when he was at school. And I remember listening to it and thinking, I don't believe you. I do not believe a teacher said that. And it so happened that the teacher he accused of saying that is a member of the Scottish Family Party. And you know, she said that and she said, no, it's just rubbish. She never said anything remotely like that. But in the Parliament, there's no critical thinking that says, wait, hang on a minute, let's just see how credible this is. It's just, you're the goodies, we're the goodies too, so we believe everything you say. What do you want us to do?
Yeah, well, it's part of this kind of hashtag believe framework, which we've seen following the Johnny Depp trial as well, which is it's again astonishing that how illiberal this sort of trend is, that they're not interested in actually trying to find truth and justice. There's just a completely partisan idea that if someone comes and says that I'm a victim of whatever it is, then they must be believed. I mean, that's deeply, deeply troubling for anyone who wants to have a kind of balanced, just society. You know, whatever the issue is, you know, and the person might be true and they might be right and you might be sympathetic to them, but at least you should try and actually get to some sense of objective truth and evidence about things, rather than just kind of adopt these positions, regardless of other opposing facts.
Yeah. With the election last year, we got a sort of deluge of hate communication by all sorts of means. And some of it was threatening. It was like threatening what we're going to do to your office. Our office doesn't really exist. It's a virtual office. But anyway, they were threatening what they were going to do to it. And I've seen things like Humza Yousaf got someone prosecuted for saying he was probably having a whip round for terrorists or something. So I got all this stuff, which was like 10 times worse and 100 times as much of it. And some of it was genuinely threatening. So I took it along to the police station. And a lot of, almost all of it, I would say, was sort of from LGBT activists. So I went to the police station and spoke to the desk sergeant on either side of the window where I was talking to him, with big like LGBT posters. And needless to say, I handed all this material over. I mean, what did they do with it? I mean, initially they said, "Oh yeah, this is clearly offensive communication, or this, that, and the other. Oh, we'll definitely be following this up. This one's threatening." What happened at the end of it? Of course, nothing. Nothing. Not a thing. So Humza Yousaf, with his someone saying you probably have a whip round for the terrorists, bloke ends up in court and prosecuted. I mean, this wodge of stuff, like 10 times worse. 10 times worse. Nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing at all.
Although, having said that, I'm a big fan of free speech, as you know, so I don't like the Communications Act. I can understand. I can understand why you did it, but yes, the
two reasons it is. Some of it was threatening, which I think it is reasonable to report to the police. Some of it was threatening. The other I put in. Basically, I've had other experiences as well where I won't go into the details. Where a clear-cut crime was committed against me by an LGBT activist, basically, and the police just refused to do anything about it. So it was more a matter of demonstrating what they were like, rather than actually thinking anyone was going to get prosecuted for it.
I mean, I hope I'm wrong about this, but one of my concerns at the minute is because society is kind of giving virtue. You're on the side of the angels to certain groups and individuals, and almost encouraging the idea that if someone offends you, you have a right to do something about it.
Yeah.
Then I'm kind of just waiting for people to start getting attacked physically, because there's been this complete crossover now in terms of the sense of words and actual physical violence.
Yeah.
Where society has almost come to the conclusion that words are worse. Words are more damaging than actual physical violence. And as society moves in that way, it's a bit like what's his name at the Oscars, who got up and slapped that guy, right? I think, and I'm extrapolating, but I think in a few years ago he wouldn't have done that, but now he thinks he's been offended, his wife's been offended, he can get up and in front of everybody slap someone across the face, and that's entirely fine, right? And he thinks that is justified because of the framework of offense, and that it really worries me that that's where we're moving in society. That the more we elevate this sense of vulnerability, victimhood, and being offended, the more we will encourage people to think they can use violence. I mean, we've seen this with the pulling down of statues as an example of, physical force and vandalism, and essentially being supported in doing it in the Colson statue example. And I know that's just a statue, but that is a concern I have, that it'll start to be people who start to get attacked. Because it just makes sense, it's logical.
I find it terrifying that the Cambridge English Dictionary online edition defines violence as actions or words designed to hurt someone. That's the dictionary definition.
That's interesting. I wonder when that changed, because that must be recent.
I always thought dictionaries told you what words meant, not what political activists wished they meant. But Cambridge University, obviously, I'm out of date.
Is it Cambridge? Is it Oxford or Cambridge?
Cambridge.
Cambridge, right? Okay.
Cambridge English Dictionary. They've got violence, actions or words.
Right, that's interesting. Yeah,
I couldn't believe it when I read it. I was like double checking. Is this really the website?
I'll try and find out when that changed, because I bet it must have been in the last 5 years when they've changed it. We'll
there's an article for you in the Times.
That's perfect, actually. Absolutely perfect illustration of it.
I will look forward to reading your article in the Herald or the Times on that.
I'll give you a mention.
Well, that was a fascinating discussion as ever. You must come back before too long, because there's a million other things we could talk about. But your perspectives were fascinating and thought-provoking. So thanks very much for joining us, and
Thank you.
hope to see you again before too long.
Cheers.
Right, thanks for watching, everyone, and see you next week.